attorney. Been an attorney for about 30 years, and I've been judging competition here for, say, about 10 years or so.
Hi, my name is Steve Shapiro. I'm a semi-retired trial lawyer. I'm here to review.
My name is Kwesi O'Henny, and I'm a labor and employment arbitrator and also securities, commodities, and futures mediator.
Hi, my name is Stephen Armstrong, an attorney with the New York State Liquor Authority.
Good morning, Your Honors. My name is Skylar Liajo. I plan to attend Evolving.
Good morning, Your Honors. My name is Althea Brennan, and I will be attending Cornell University.
Good morning. My name is Jillian Perry, and I plan to attend Fordham University.
Good morning. My name is Stephanie, and I'll be a timer.
Okay, so we know we have 4 minutes. I'll leave the question on 4 minutes. You have answer. Keep the notes away, and we'll have 6 minutes of questions. Okay, very good. We'll leave the question. Question 1. Federalist 51 states that in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. John Locke said, the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. For it being a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others. Do you agree with these ideas? Why or why not? So question 1. To what extent, if any, do you think that Congress has given some of its legislative responsibilities to the executive or judicial branches? Why might it do so, and what evidence do you have to support this position? Second question. What legislative powers are held by the executive and judicial branches? What problems might be posed for democracy if the balance of legislative power were to shift to these branches? Explain your position.
We agree with Madison and Locke's ideas because the legislative branch derives its power most directly from the people. In Federalist 51, Madison emphasizes that a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control upon the government. This embodies the fundamental constitutional principle of popular sovereignty, a government that derives its just powers from the people, from the consent of the governed. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress broad lawmaking powers, including the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer. It is most important that Congress have the power to make laws because it is directly accountable to the people by frequent elections. Additionally, Congress has the most important power of the purse, which according to James Madison is the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people. This embodies the fundamental constitutional principle of republicanism because we are a representative government. The structure of the election of members of Congress set out in Article 1 and the 17th Amendment are evidence that the legislative branch is most closely linked to the people. The frequent and direct engagement of the people with Congress forms the legitimacy to the legislative branch.
Generally, Congress has refused to give up most of its legislative authority. Article 1, Section 8 limits the legislative power herein granted to Congress. In U.S. v. Shreveport-Grain, the Supreme Court stated that Congress cannot delegate powers that are strictly and exclusively legislative. However, in J.W. Hampton v. United States, the court upheld Congress's delegation of tariff-setting authority to the President where it was made within defined limits. Congress delegates legislative responsibility to administrative agencies for regulation and rulemaking purposes under such defined limits. These agencies, such as the EPA, allow the legislature to transfer administrative responsibilities and institute detailed policy without congressional review, which saves time and resources. Lastly, legislative power is delegated under Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, which allows the President to convene, adjourn, and recommend bills to Congress. Although there is some delegation of legislative power, Congress has largely retained its responsibility, remaining loyal to its design, as a check on the executive and judicial branches and a true reflection of popular sovereignty.
The executive has the ability to block legislation through the presidential veto, a allowing the executive branch to play an active role in the passage of legislation. The president also has the ability to implement executive orders that have the force of law. Executive orders can promote a president's policy agenda and be used to manage and mobilize the vast resources of the federal government. This was showcased in President Eisenhower's signing of an executive order that federalized the National Guard to maintain order during the integration of public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. The judicial branch has the power of judicial review, as recognized by the Supreme Court in Marbury v. Madison and confirmed in Aaron v. Cooper. Judicial review gives the judiciary the power to interpret and apply the Constitution to both legislative and executive acts. In U.S. v. Eichmann, the Supreme Court declared the Flag Protection Act unconstitutional on the basis that it violated free speech based on its content, not time, place, or manner. If the balance of legislative power were to shift to the executive and judicial branches, a limited government would cease to exist. The fundamental constitutional principles of separation of powers and checks and balances would be disrupted, resulting in what James Madison described in Federalist 47 as the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny.
Pretty good. We'll now have 6 minutes of follow-up.
If you were to choose which branch of government should have the most power, which one would you choose and why?
I would choose the legislative branch to have the most power because it's directly represented by the people through direct elections.
Because we are a popular sovereignty and the government that we have is based on the consent of the governed as outlined by John Locke in his 2 Threes of government, it's necessary that the people that are most closely tied to the people with the most direct elections, with the smallest amount of land that they represent and the smallest amount of people, are the ones that are making the largest decisions that affect the people's lives most directly.
I respectfully disagree with my colleagues and believe that the judicial branch should have the most power in the federal government because its members are independent, they are not tied to political parties, and regularly apply constitutional knowledge to legislation in an independent manner.
Why do you say the judicial branch isn't tied to judicial parties?
Well, the judicial branch, the members of it are given lifetime appointments, and so there's not really a need to finance campaigns and work with political parties in that manner. However, their moral alignments may coincide with a political party.
I respectfully disagree with my colleague. Although I think that by design the Supreme Court is meant to be bipartisan, that's not the case today. I think that we were moving towards that, and the true showing of that was in the Supreme Court decision Bush v. Gore, where the judicial branch, the Supreme Court essentially decided a presidential election. And continuing that to today, Supreme Court nominations are an incredibly political process that can be seen in Mitch McConnell's blocking of potential Supreme Court Justice Merrick Garland, and then in the nomination and then preceding hearings of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in which Kavanaugh, it was very clear that the process was incredibly partisan.
In your opening statement, the legislature had a check on the judiciary. What does that mean? What's this mean for that check on the judiciary?
Well, legislative supremacy was intended by the founding fathers. So Congress is given the powers such as the necessary and proper clause to create legislation that they believe will apply most directly to the people of the United States. So the legislative has a more active power, whereas the judiciary has a more passive power, a more reactory responsibility.
Going off of what my colleague just stated, the judiciary doesn't have any teeth to what it says. So although it can make decisions regarding specific things, it's really only the legislature and the executive that can enforce this. I believe also that there's a check on the judiciary in the sense of securing people's natural rights when the court has not done that yet. An example of this would be the Indian Citizenship Act, in which the legislative branch, not the judicial branch, made the decision that Native Americans should have the right to vote.
What do you think about the current balance of power among the branches of the national government? Do you think things are fine as they are, or should changes be made?
I think over time the executive has grown in power. In Article 2, it's very broad and vague on the powers of the executive, and right now, with the government shutdown and other acts made by presidents, such as Abraham Lincoln in suspending the writ of habeas corpus, has showed the executive to abuse its power.
Continuing with what my colleague just said, there's been certain legislative acts that have given the president what I believe has too much power, such as the National Emergencies Act, which allowed the president to state that the government was in a time of emergency, which in theory is something that's positive because it allows the president to act energetically, as Hamilton stated in the Federalist Papers, and respond to crisis. However, the process of declaring the government as in crisis has become an incredibly divisive statement. This can be seen currently as President Trump has stated that he may potentially put the government currently into a crisis regarding the southern border, and then use funds that weren't directly delegated by Congress to build the border wall.
I believe that the system of separation of powers and checks and balances is still present in the government today, specifically through the acts like the Budget Impoundment and Control Act, which was passed to limit the president's ability to allocate funds that were not done that way by Congress, and also with the War Powers Act, which limited the president's ability as commander-in-chief of the army.
And to which branch of government do you think the Constitution gives the most power?
I believe the legislative branch has the most power. In Article 1, it's very specific on the powers. Specifically, Article 1, Section 8, they have the power to declare war, they have the power of naturalization, and the power of divorce.
I respectfully disagree with my colleague and believe that Article 2 gives the executive branch the most power in the Constitution because it is very vague and the powers aren't necessarily specified, allowing the executive to expand their power in ways unimagined by the Founding Fathers.
Continuing with what my colleague just stated, the unitary executive theory, which was proposed by Jonathan Yu, states that the president themselves not only is in charge of the entire executive branch, but also should wield the most amount of power within the three branches of government. And I believe that this becomes evident during times of war when the president can make very broad national security decisions without the consent of Congress. And although Congress does have the power to declare war, as my colleague previously stated, this power can go largely unkept as the War Powers Act is the War Powers Act is broadly believed to be an unconstitutional check on the executive. So although the president may need to get consent from Congress within 60 days, once there has been bombings or some sort of military response to national emergency, it already is wielding a vast amount of executive power.
So, if you've been involved in the past, we used to go out in caucus, but we're a little shorter on time this year, so we're just going to give some direct feedback. What's the name?
I've been a trial lawyer for almost 50 years, and my experience is that preparation, thinking about issues, waking up in the middle of the night, ideas, or in the morning with a new thought because your brain is working while you're asleep, is enlarging the key to success. I haven't seen an example like you three presented of that from very trial lawyers, let alone one of the problems that trial lawyers have is they start believing that their mouth will always work even if their brain hasn't. But you guys marshal support for your arguments from such a wide range that extraordinarily impressive. And you clearly, whoever did the preparation, the work that you were preparing to help you prepare, did a superb job. You clearly understand the concepts you're talking about, and you understand the sources that you're citing, and really congratulations for a superb performance.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I mean, you did a real nice job of, bringing in examples, and giving us examples represent, which is, you know, very important. Most of them do a real nice job of working for them, which is really good, you know, kids things, participation, things like that. Yeah, just a really nice job.
And I think that, again, your preparation was key. Your presentation was evident. I always enjoy a little bit of dissension. I think that it's healthy in terms of trying to kind of, it helps you to build your argument, right? So if someone has an opposing argument, and you know, you say, okay, I need to do a little more research so I can come and hit them with this, you know, and you know, I pulled this case law, and you know, I read the book and I saw this person made this statement too, and this was my argument. So it's really good that that you're able to present, not just throw something out there, but you throw it, you articulate it very well, and you support it. You know, you say, you know, I respectfully disagree with my colleague, and you present your argument. So I think that that's healthy as well. So it was an overall good presentation.
I would second everything that's been said. It's just excellent all around.
Thank you.
Okay. Good luck, and teachers, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Excellent job.
Nice job. Now we have a 20-minute break. Lot of great examples and articulating your examples.
Coming up, did I do a good
One thing though, is your group, you two are going again, and for the group that's going, make sure you're listening to the judges carefully. There was one question there. He asked you, what's the legislative presentation? You mentioned that the legislature has a check on the judiciary, and you didn't answer that question at all, which you know, but you do know, we've talked about, you know, they want to hear about that the Senate has to confirm appointments of judges and that they have power to purchase those kinds of things. But, you know, this is what I've said in class, the sheer content of everything else you put in, because you've had so many examples, makes that, that's a tiny bump that is insignificant. So, but as you know, when you're sitting up there, unit 5 and unit 6, it's true you listen, but that was jam-packed with examples and great examples that we've talked about, and we brought it all back out there. And some of the judges were just like, please, no more examples. You're hurting me. So, good job.
Yeah, good job.
Really good job. So, you know what, there's a lot going on when you're up there. You had so much in every other answer. Don't worry. Yes, you have like 18 minutes left.
Yes, yeah.